this is Lady Boulay, and welcome back to Black American Lineage. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for your thumbs up, and thank you for your comments. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. Well, as we run up to Black History Month, we're talking about those that built the United States Capitol. Now, when we listen to white supremacists on these social media platforms, they will talk about, we built the country, we built the country. And they make it seem like some romantic, glorious affair. But building this country was neither romantic nor glorious. It was hard, grueling, brutal labor. Free labor by black people who were brought to this country in slave ships against their will. So today we're honoring all those slaves that built the U.S. Capitol. I saw this on my Facebook page and I thought it would be fitting to do a video about this at this time. On this subject, I want to share part of an article that I read in the White House Historical Association. It says, the lengthy process of constructing the U.S. Capitol relied upon free and enslaved laborers at every step. As a city in its infancy, Washington, D.C. frequently experienced a shortage of free white craftsmen for hire on construction projects. I'm going to say that they weren't able to find any free white craftsmen for any project, and nobody would blame the white people for not working for free. Instead, enslaved laborers from the surrounding slave states of Maryland and Virginia made up a bountiful, cheap workforce that could be hired out for work on the president's house, the White House, and the Capitol. So, enslaved laborers from Virginia and Maryland made up the free workforce that built the White House and the Capitol. So here's an interesting bit of information. The federal government paid plantation owners for use of their enslaved workforce. The owners pocketed the wages while the federal government provided housing, some medical care, and food for all laborers under their watch. It was financially lucrative for both parties, keeping labor costs down for the fledgling government while providing between $55 and $65 a year for slave owners. So, see, even though the enslaved people built these structures, the slave owners got the money. You just can't make this up. Also, by leasing these enslaved people from these plantations, it prevented the federal government of the United States from actually purchasing and owning enslaved people. So they thought they were being very clever by hiring the enslaved people from those plantations, but they were still exploiting the labor of the enslaved people. This is what Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. looks like today, January 2025. But when construction began on Capitol Hill in the late 1700s, it was a wooded area. The laborers, the enslaved people, had to clear the area by chopping trees, moving soil, and preparing for the building's foundation. Once they had cleared the area, they had to do all of the work, including carpentry, masonry, carting building supplies from one place to the other, rafting, roofing, plastering, glazing, and painting, as well as brick making and sawing. This work requires skill, practice, and endurance. And let's remember, these people were not paid for all of this work. And also, let's make something really clear. The enslaved people brought these skills with them. When they needed laborers to do a particular skill, they went into Africa and captured the people in the area where they specialized in those skills. If they needed carpenters, brick masons, blacksmiths, painters, whatever they needed, they went into those areas and raided those areas and forced those people into slavery. This was not a case where white people taught them how to do these things. They knew how to do these things when they came here, because the reality is white people couldn't teach them how to do the things because they didn't know how to do them themselves. Here's another familiar fact about enslaved people. While the enslaved people toiled building the White House and the Capitol building, overseers supervised the progress. They were directed to keep the enslaved people working from sunrise to sunset. Ken to cane is what they said. Now this was just for the enslaved people, not for the hired workers, the white people. And I doubt if it were any white people there, to be honest. This grueling hard labor went on from the late 1700s into the mid 1800s. During this long building process, the work was so hard and the treatment of these men was so bad, so terrible, that many of them ran away. And after they ran away, large sums of money were offered for their reward. And in some cases, the men didn't run away. They just slowed down and just wouldn't have do the work because it went on for decades and they weren't getting any pay. They were working them to death and the treatment of them was brutal. So who would blame them for running away? Yet they got the work done. They got the Capitol building, the White House, and many other government buildings in Washington, D.C. built. They built it. The enslaved people who worked on the Capitol building were indeed very skilled. They completed the Capitol dome and the Statue of Freedom at the top of the dome, which is shown here. So they were very skilled workers. This article acknowledges that in the days of slavery, Washington, D.C. was a silent witness to the atrocities of slavery. Not far from the White House stood the Yellow House slave jail, where future President Abraham Lincoln commented in 1854 that, in view from the windows of the Capitol, he could see a sort of Negro livery stable where droves of Negroes were collected, temporarily kept, and finally taken to Southern markets precisely like droves of horses, taken to those Southern markets to be sold at auction like animals. In 1862, slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C., and by 1868, major expansions and additions to the Capitol were complete. The United States Capitol building, as we know it today, would not stand without the contributions of hundreds of enslaved and free laborers. Today, these individuals are recognized by a commemorative marker in Emancipation Hall, added to the Capitol Visitor Center in 2012, over 200 years after the Capitol's initial construction. It is important for Black Americans to uncover these historical facts about our history because people would like to glamorize the building of America. These white supremacists talking about we built the country without having any idea what went into building this country. So this is an important part of Black American history as well as American history. Black American history is American history. We have to claim our contributions to this country because if we don't, somebody else is standing willing to take credit for what our people did and what we're doing now. We're still making history in this country, but there are people who are willing to do nothing on the work end but take credit on the completion end. So it is important for us to study, to challenge the misinformation that comes from other people. Because when you don't know your history, when other people start running their mouth, you don't know how to correct them. And they will sit there with all of their arrogance and full chest and boldness and say, we built the country, when they absolutely did not. Some of their families didn't even get here until the early 1900s when the real infrastructure of America was already in place.
The U.S. Capitol is one of the most recognizable man-made landmarks in the country. With its stately white dome, the building serves as an international symbol of the country's representative democracy. But until recently, little was known about the people who actually built the massive structure. Now a traveling exhibit entitled From Freedom's Shadow reveals that most of the Capitol was built by black slaves from the late 1700s through 1863. Felicia Bell with the Capitol Historical Society is the exhibit's curator. She says at the time, large numbers of slaves were used to construct many government buildings throughout the United States.
The fact that they were skilled and already actively hired out to build other significant structures even prior to the Capitol. So, knowing that, you know that these enslaved people were instrumental in the early establishment of the United States and of these urban centers.
The exhibition chronicles the methods used to recruit slaves for building the Capitol. Old records show construction contractors used a practice known as hiring out, which involved white slave owners getting paid for allowing their slaves to be used as temporary laborers. The slaves themselves were only paid if they worked nights, Sundays, and holidays.
The documents indicate these individuals, these owners, seeking payment for their laborers hired out, sometimes one laborer, sometimes several. And the rate of pay, the typical rate of pay was $5 per month per enslaved person, which was a pretty good rate of pay for the time period.
The African American slaves worked alongside white laborers, cutting timber, hauling stone, and other types of construction work. Ironically, even the famous 6-meter-high Statue of Freedom, which was placed atop the Capitol dome during the Civil War, was cast in bronze by a slave, Philip Reed. Curator Bell says an eyewitness account of the work environment was recorded by a Polish traveler who visited the Capitol construction site.
He talked about how the white laborers were drinking most of the day, and it was the enslaved laborers who were doing the work, and how he was appalled when he found out that these enslaved men were not being paid, that their owners were being paid for hiring them out.
The traveling exhibition has been on display at many schools across the country. At Howard University in Washington, students such as Nyan Crawford are fascinated about the Capitol's history and the role blacks played in building the historic landmark.
It's finally great to see people bringing this information forward so more people can learn about it. I've definitely learned a great deal today, and by looking at the exhibit, who participated and how they participated, we never really knew what contributions were made in the past.
Ms. Bell says the Capitol's history should not be glossed over because of the painful memories of slavery. She says the exhibit is important because it helps people understand the significant role African Americans had, not just in building the Capitol, but in building the nation. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Washington.
Thank you for listening. Have a good evening.